I really don't think Netanyahu should be surprised that the world is reacting with severe criticism to the level of humanitarian suffering in Gaza.
Benjamin Netanyahu has had some really strong words for Keir Starmer. He's accused the British Prime Minister of being on the wrong side of history. He's attacked Keir Starmer and the leaders of France and Canada, saying that they had effectively said that they want Hamas to remain in power. He also accused Starmer, Macron and Mark Carney of siding with mass murderers, rapists, baby killers and kidnappers.
You won't be surprised to learn that Hamas thanked President Macron and Prime Ministers Starmer and Carney for demanding that Israel end its war in Gaza immediately. Hamas was right to thank them, because by issuing their demand, replete with a threat of sanctions against Israel, not Hamas, these three leaders effectively said they want Hamas to remain in power. I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity. And you're on the wrong side of history.
Very strong words there from the Israeli Prime Minister, speaking after Thursday's very awful attack in Washington in which 2 young Israeli embassy staff were murdered. Now, days earlier, the UK, France and Canada had condemned Israel's expanded offensive in Gaza as disproportionate and described the humanitarian situation as intolerable. The UK also suspended talks with Israel over a possible trade deal. Well, let's now speak with the retired British diplomat Lord Peter Ricketts, who was chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee under Tony Blair and was also the government's national security advisor under David Cameron. Peter, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Aisha.
Very strong words there from Benjamin Netanyahu. What did you make of his response?
Well, this is his standard operating technique, I'm afraid. When he feels under pressure, which he is under pressure domestically and internationally for the dire, awful state of affairs in Gaza as a result of the blockade that Israel has operated there, when he's under pressure, he lashes out in the most aggressive way he possibly can. And his aim, of course, is to deter international leaders from criticizing Israel and Israel's policy in Gaza. But let's be clear, it's entirely possible both to denounce Hamas terrorism, the awful attacks on the 7th of October, detaining hostages, the horrific murder of the young Israeli couple in Washington a couple of days ago, and criticize Israel for breaching international humanitarian law and causing all that suffering in Gaza. It is not anti-Semitic to make reasoned criticism of Israel. Many very distinguished Israelis, including former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and the leader of their Democrat Party, Yair Goldman, former general, saying far tougher things about Israel than the British government is, talking about it being a pariah state, close to war crimes. So I think Keir Starmer should stand his ground. What he said was entirely reasonable. It is intolerable what's happening in Gaza. We will stand with the Israelis, of course, when their security is threatened, but it is perfectly fair to criticize Israeli government policies.
I mean, there's so much to unpack with this. I mean, I completely agree with everything you've said, but what's interesting is this is the strongest language we've seen in some time from Britain and indeed these other players as well, the UK, France and Canada, because one does get the impression that there is a nervousness around how to sort of criticise Israel in the right way, because none of them want to be seen as anti-Semitic at all. And, Keir Starmer has, the Labour Party in Britain has had problems with anti-Semitism. So I think that will loom very large in Keir Starmer's mind. And, he's absolutely, not an anti-Semitic person at all. But it's interesting that Keir Starmer here in the UK has come under some criticism for not speaking out. And now the four leaders come out and do this and immediately get this very, very strong attack from Netanyahu. Does this mean that any criticism of Israel is going to be met with this kind of condemnation, as you say? And does that mean that actually we're sort of voiceless in the sense that we will have no impact on Netanyahu?
Well, in a way, are you sure you could say we have had an impact on Netanyahu? Because, as you say, he felt it necessary to come out with this pretty outrageous, aggressive attack on the three democratic leaders who are saying perfectly reasonable and defensible things. And by the way, who've stood with Israel at difficult times in recent months, for example, when Israel came under attack from Iranian missiles. So yes, this is definitely Netanyahu getting his strike in, trying to deter further criticism of Israel. And of course, the criticism has been coming from all around the world. It's been coming from within Israel as well. And the British government's language has been ratcheted up because of the dramatic deterioration of what's happening in Gaza, which Tom Fletcher, the former British diplomat, now the emergency relief coordinator for the UN, called out in extremely harrowing terms in the Security Council 10 days ago. Looming starvation, medical system collapsing, and so on. I mean, I really don't think Netanyahu should be surprised that the world is reacting with severe criticism to the level of humanitarian suffering in Gaza.
Look, do you think it does feel that there has been, I'd say collectively, a sort of change in tone in terms of critique of Israel just over the last week to 10 days? We've seen lots of people speaking out. I mean, I was watching a very interesting debate actually chaired by Piers Morgan on his show, and he's always been a very staunch defender and supporter of Israel, and he himself said, look, I think I've got things wrong, and I think it's time for Israel to pull back in terms of what's happening with Gaza. So there has been a bit of a turn in tone. Do you think do you think that is happening across diplomatic circles? Do you think that is a trend that we're seeing now?
Yes, I think it's a reaction to events on the ground. I mean, an 11-week blockade where no food, water, medicine was allowed into Gaza, driving people to the point of starvation, 2 million people, and the risk of medical system completely collapsing. I mean, these are pretty unprecedented events. And then perhaps the thing that triggered off the spike in international criticism was coupled now with a new military assault on Gaza. As if the people of Gaza haven't suffered enough, then there is now yet another assault involving the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people around Gaza. So when Mr. Netanyahu talks about being on the side of history, I think history is going to judge pretty harshly the way the Israeli government have responded. They absolutely had the right for self-defense after the terrible attacks of the 7th of October. Nobody denies that. Of course, everybody wants to see the hostages home. But the way they have dealt with Gaza, particularly in the last few months, has been more and more unacceptable. That's what Western governments have been saying.
And how do you think they should have responded, Peter?
Well, I think they responded as they should have done. I mean, if I had been advising them, I think I'd have been encouraging them to take more specific steps to make clear where they stand. At the moment, our rhetoric is very strong. The number of measures taken actually to give effect to it are quite limited. To suspend trade talks, which actually hadn't happened since April 2024, is a pretty modest step. There are other steps which could well be taken. Suspend all arms sales, not just part of them. Put sanctions on some of the ultra-nationalist ministers, who've been inciting violence and calling for starvation to be used as a weapon of policy in Gaza. I mean, there are other steps that can be taken, but I think the tone of Western leaders, the urgency of calls for a ceasefire to get humanitarian aid in and the hostages out, I mean, I think they've been exactly right.
Well, okay, I'm going to read a couple of messages that have come through because there's strong views on the other side as well. Someone called Richard says, please ask Peter Ricketts, what culpability does he think Hamas have for the situation in Gaza? Hamas started this war and have set the battlefield by embedding themselves within the civilian population and a total disregard for the rules of war. What would you say to Richard, Peter?
Well, I agree with Richard. I mean, Hamas have behaved appallingly. They are a terrorist organization, and they've suffered enormously for that war crime they committed in attacking Israeli civilians and then holding hostages. And I'm sure they do hide amongst the civilian community. But Israel is an occupying power, and occupying powers have duties and responsibilities under international law, even when they're in very difficult struggle with terrorist organizations, to protect the civilian population and act with humanity towards civilians. And I think those are the problems. Trying to starve entire population of Gaza as part of an assault on Hamas and is clearly not right. So yes, absolutely, Hamas are disgraceful beyond the pale of civilized society, but Israel, as a democracy, as a rules-respecting country, ought to be operating within the established laws of how to do this.
Okay, I've got another. There's a guy called James who sent in many messages. I'll just read one of them, James, because you have sent quite a few in. He says, virtue signalling criticism of Israel, lots of criticism, but no realistic alternatives to freeing the hostages and ending Palestinian terrorists. And I suppose what that question gets to, Peter, is, look, many people will have a lot of sympathy for what you say, myself included, but there is the very real question of, Hamas have said that they were pleased about what happened on October the 7th. They would come back and do it again and again. What does one do to sort of, protect the Israelis from those people within Hamas?
Well, perfectly fair points. I'm sorry he thinks it's virtue signaling. I'm trying to think dispassionately about a very difficult situation. I mean, the answer is a ceasefire. When have hostages been released? Mainly over the last year and a half. It's been when there's been ceasefires. That's when people have gone home. And a ceasefire then needs to lead on to a political settlement, which of course must exclude Hamas from any role in the future of Gaza, but which also must give the Palestinians some sort of hope for the future. Because a solution which involves Israeli occupation of Palestine, both parts of it, West Bank and Gaza, for the indefinite future, is, I'm afraid, only going to stoke up further terrorism for the next generation to come. So I think a ceasefire, release of hostages, and then building a political settlement which excludes Hamas, those are the sort of steps that the government ought to be taking. I think the British government is working on a solution like that, but at the moment the Netanyahu government refuses it and seems to see a future which is only Israeli military occupation, forever. And I just don't think that is a stable, longer-term solution or good one for the next generation on either side of the divide.
And final questions come from one of our listeners, Brian, who says to both of us, we're both wrong. Most Jews in this country think that the unthinking criticism has helped stoke anti-Semitism. What would you say to Brian, Peter?
Well, I mean, everybody is entitled to their view. And I don't believe that that's true. I don't think it's unthinking criticism. I think Britain has been working very hard for a settlement, for a ceasefire, to get the hostages out. And it has to involve criticism of both sides where necessary.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid I don't accept that. But of course, everybody's entitled to their own view on this very, very difficult situation.
And I think that's the point. It's a very difficult situation. There's a huge amount of pain for people on both sides of this awful conflict. And I suppose, Brian, my question back to you would be, are you basically saying that we are never allowed to criticise Israel, that Israel is allowed to do exactly what it wants and nobody is ever allowed to criticise Israel? That's the question I would pose back to you. But I'd genuinely be interested to know what you think about that. Well, look, Peter, thank you very much for your time. Very interesting conversation. That's Lord Peter Ricketts there.